Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Western Canon Challenge, where we are reading the entirety of the Western Literary Canon out loud. Today we are continuing journal collection number 40. We are up to August 6th of the year 1849, and with that said, I'll go ahead and get started reading. August 6th. Revolution is, quote, Lord of the visionary eye, whose lid once raised remains aghast and will not fall. End quote. Nature never reproduces the fossil strata. There are 3 degrees in philosophy. Plato came with geometry, that was 1 degree. Plotinus came with mythology, Zoroastrian or Magian illumination, etc., as exalted or stilted Plato. That was the 2nd degree. But now comes my friend with palmistry, phrenology, mesmerism, and Divisian revelation. This is the 3rd degree, and bearing the same relation to Plotinism which that bore to Platonism. The French follow the course of rivers, the English hug the seashore. And then there is an untranslated French quotation below. The French change their constitution as often as their shirt. Will you spend your income or will you invest it? It could not be said of Buna that she lived entirely for her dinner, though she was tenderly, patiently absorbed in that capital event of the day. No, for she was not less dedicated to her supper, nor less to her breakfast. He had studied her character imperfectly, who thought she lived in these. No, she wished to keep her feet warm, and she was addicted to a soft seat, and expended a skill and generalship on recurring the red chair and a corner out of the draught and in the air, worthy of a higher seat in heaven. Neither on these was she exhausted. In a frivolous age, Buna was earnest. She screamed, she groaned, she watched at night, she waited by day for her omelette and her lamp with smooth handle, and when she went out of the house, it was a perfect row for half an hour. Buna had catarrh, pleurisy, rush of blood to the head, apoplexy, diabetes, diarrhea, sunstroke, atrophy, worms, palsy, erysipelas, consumption, and dropsy. The magnet was thrown into Europe, and all philosophy has taken a direction from it. Men have studied its currents, and got the vortex, the spiral, and the polarity which now inundate all thinking in all languages, and end in the charlatanism of tractors, of mesmerism and phrenology, pathetism and Davis. Shakespeare's fun is as wise as his earnest. Its foundations are below the frost. His is a moral muse simply from its depth, and I value the intermixture of the common and the transcendental as in nature. Then also his knowledge of structure and complexion. He knows what is in a blue eye, and what is in a just skin, and does justice to both. He is all pulverized into proverbs and dispersed into human discourse. Greatness. The difference is immense to appearance certainly between man and man. Plato or Swedenborg is just ready to make a world. If he do not like this, he is Krishna. It is no matter how fine is your rhetoric or how strong is your understanding, no book is good which is not written by the instincts. A fatal frost makes cheerless and undesirable every house where animal heat is not. Cold allegory makes us yawn, whatever elegance it may have. The Indian squaw with the decisive hat has saved herself a world of vexation. The tragedy of our women begins with the bonnet. Only think of the whole Caucasian race damning the women to cover themselves with this frippery of rye, straw, and tags, that they may be at the mercy of every shower of rain. A meeting-house full of women, and a shower coming up, it is as if we had dressed them all in paper. Put on the squaw's man's hat, and you amputate so much misery. Yesterday a ride and walk with Thoreau to Acton. We climbed to the top of Nagog Hill, and afterward of Nashuba, the old domain of Tatawatan and his praying Indians. The wide landscape is one vast forest skirted by villages in the horizon. We saw Littleton, Acton, Concord, Chelmsford, Tinsborough, Dracut. On the western side, the old mountains ending with Ancanunuk on the north. The geology is unlike ours, and the granite ledges are perpendicular. Fort Pond is a picturesque sheet with a fine peninsula scattered, park-like with the noble pines on the western side. Grass Pond, a pretty lake. Nagog seen from the Nagog Hill is best, and Long Pond we came to the shore of. These four ponds dictated, of course, Tahawatan's location of his 600 acres. Also, we visited the top of Strawberry Hill and a big chestnut tree. I thought the Concord Society should meet and assign its business to committees. Thus, Mr. Channing presented a report on Baker Farm, Mr. Thoreau a report on Fort Pond, the cromlech and the remains of a swamp fort near the pond. Mr. E. called the attention to the Ebby Hubbard Park. Miss E. Hoare presented a bunch of Linnea borealis found in Concord. Mr. C. read a paper on the foliaceous and sponge-like formations by spring thaw and the argillite of the deep cut on the railroad, and so forth. There is something finer in our sky and climate than we have senses to appreciate. It escapes us, and yet is only just beyond our reach. Tantalus must have finer senses. The houses in Acton seemed to be filled with fat old people who looked like old tomatoes, their faces crumpled into red collops, fatting and rotting at their ease. Eyes and no eyes. One man sees the fact or object, and another sees the power of it. One the triangle, and the other the cone which is generated by the revolution of a triangle. August 29th. Love is the bright foreigner, the foreign self. Hungary, it seems, must take the yoke again, and Austria and Italy and Prussia and France. Only the English race can be trusted with freedom. The French proclamations are hysterical. If I had a barnyard fowl that wanted a name, I should call him France. Never was national symbol so comically fit. Plato's fame does not stand on a syllogism or on any specimen of the Socratic argumentation. He is much more than an expert, for we do not listen with much respect to the verses of a man who is only a poet, nor to the calculations of a man who is only an algebraist. But if the man is at the same time acquainted with the geometrical foundations of things, and with their moral purposes, and sees the festal splendor of the day, his poetry is exact, and his arithmetic musical. His poetry and his mathematics accredit each other. I look upon the stress laid by Plato on geometry as highly significant. Of course, he cannot often find a reader, but of course he ought to have written so. Parker thinks that to know Plato you must read Plato thoroughly and his commentators, and I think Parker would require a good drill in Greek history too. I have no objection to hear this urged on any but a Platonist, but when erudition is insisted on to Herbert or Henry Moore, I hear it as if, to know the tree, you should make me eat all the apples. It is not granted to one man to express himself adequately more than a few times, and I believe fully, in spite of sneers, in interpreting the French Revolution by anecdotes, though not every diner out can do it. To know the flavor of tansy, must I eat all the tansy that grows by the wall? But if a man cannot answer me in 10 words, he is not wise. Plato's vision is not illimitable, but it is not self-limited by its own obliquity, or by fogs and walls which its own vices create. Plato is to mankind what Paris or London is to Europe. Europe concentrates itself into a capital. He has not seen Europe who has not seen its cities. Plato codifies and catalogues and distributes. In his broad daylight things reappear as they stood in the sunlight, hardly shorn of a ray, yet now portable and reportable. Before, all things stood enchanted, not tangible. He comes and touches them, and henceforth anybody may. Doctrine of Degrees. The excellence of men consists in the completeness with which the lower system is taken up into the higher. Nature. In the last days of August and the 1st of September, the woods are full of agarics. September 4th. Dante's imagination is the nearest to hands and feet that we have seen. Webster. It is true that Webster has never done anything up to the promise of his faculties. He is unmistakably able, and might have ruled America, but he was cowardly and has spent his life on specialties. When shall we see as rich a vase again? Napoleon on the other hemisphere obeyed his instincts with a fine audacity, dared all, went up to his line and over his line, found himself confronted by destiny, and yielded at last. I have many meters of men. One is their perception of identity. 'Tis a good mark of any genius, a single novel expression of the identity. Thus Lord Brooks, quote, "So words should sparks be of those fires they strike," or Donne's, quote, "that one would almost say her body thought." I hold that ecstasy will be found mechanical, if you please to say so, or nothing but an example on a higher field of the same gentle gravitation by which rivers run. Rhymes. The iterations or rhymes of nature are already an idea or principle of science, and a guide. The sun and star reflect themselves all over the world in the form of flowers and fruits, and in the human head the doctrine of series appears, which takes up again the few functions and modes, and repeats them with the new and wondrous results on a higher plane. How difficult to deal erect with the days! Each of these events which they bring, this concord thieving the muster, the ripening of plums, the shingling of the barn, all throw dust in your eyes and distract your attention. Garden Diary, August 15th. Apricot plums. September 7th. We are so late this year that I picked the first muskmelons today, 4. Today the first ripe tomato, and all the Bartlett pears to ripen in the house. The whole product of my Bartlett at the corner of the garden might count 45 pears. The green gages yield every day a supply, and the 2 purple plum trees. Today, too, we dig 7 bushels of excellent cheningos. 12th. Today, tomatoes for the first time on table. September is the month of melons. Melons last with us till 15th of October. September 7th was published Nature, Addresses and Lectures. Sent presentation copies to my mother, Lydian, Elizabeth Hoare, G.P. Bradford, H.D. Thoreau, Mrs. Barlow, W.E. Channing, S.G. Ward, J.E. Cabot, E.P. Peabody, O.W. Holmes, N. Hawthorne, William Emerson, Edward Banks, H.W. Longfellow, W.H. Channing, C.T. Jackson. New York Tribune, Boston Post, Daily Advertiser, Chronotype, Phila Literary World, Christian Examiner. The Aristotelian method was the athletic training of the scholars of the 17th century, and a method so wide and respective of such universal relations that our education seems narrow, linear, and indigent. Aristotle easily maintained his ground as master by virtue of this real superiority, until it was found that his physics were unsound. Then his metaphysics were discredited, and he was tumbled from his throne of 1,000 years. But the schoolmen were his pupils, and the Abelards, then the Galileos, Descartes, Keplers, Grotiuses, Harveys, Kirchenhausens, Malpighies, and Christian Wolffs that preceded Swedenborg show their rough training. Like Roman soldiers, they were required to carry more weight in their daily discipline than they would need in war. And so, well born of stark Norwegian berserkers, and with this iron training, comes Swedenborg and shows a power of performance incredible to the dry as dust of the present day. Nobody is entitled to ask for new great men who has not tested his strength on this anthropometer. Wilkinson is the only man I know who is broad-chested enough to cope with him. Humboldt and Goethe only rivals of their universality. The men of science, so called the scholars, are fops by the side of the colossi. True Brahmin in the morning meadows wet expound the Vedas of the violet, or hid in vines peeping through many a loop, see my plums redden and my burets stoop. Representative. It is my belief that every animal in our scale of creatures leans upward on man, and man leans downward on it. That lynx, dog, tapir, lion, lizard, camel, and crocodile all find their perfection in him. All add a support and some essential contribution to him. He is the grand lion, he the grand lynx, he the grand worm, the fish of fishes, and bird of birds, so that if one of these tribes were struck out of being, he would lose some one property of his nature. And I have no doubt that to each of these creatures man appears as if its own kind. To a lion man appears the arch-lion, to a stork the arch-stork. He is the master key for which you must go back to open each new door in the thousand-gate Thebes. It was fine when the paleontologist learned that the frog's egg on the 13th day added the gills, and on the 14th day lengthened the tail, and then, referring to the fossils, showed that this type of animals with gills must have flourished in the 13th geologic age, and these with the long tails in the 14th period. It is clear that immense advantage comes from a superior simultaneous survey of all the kingdoms of nature. How different is the attitude of Linnaeus, Cuvier, and Agassiz from that of Leeuwenhoek, or our own Dr. Harris, or Professor Peck. The comparison of tribes and kingdoms, and the procession of structure in sunfish and mammal is open to one, whilst Peck and Harris count the cilia and spines on a beetle's wing. An individual body is the momentary fixation of a portion of the solids or fluids of the universe. The tenacity of retention must be in exact proportion to the rank of the idea, which the individual represents, so a fixed idea is the unit of this. Some minds are viviparous, like Shakespeare and Goethe. Every word is a poem. Others are oviparous, alive though incomplete, and others are like trees which leave seeds and fruits on which the living can feed. Christ. Modern philosophy has not yet attempted the portrait of the blessed Jew, that wonderful youth who fascinated Asia and Europe. Swedenborg has attempted it, but he is obviously not the person to do it. He showed his incapacity by binding himself hand and foot and flinging himself at his feet by way of first salutation. The highest compliment that can be conferred. I figure to myself the world as a hollow temple, and every individual mind as an exponent of some sacred part therein, as if each man were a jet of flame affixed to some capital or node or angle or triglyph or rosette or spandrel, bringing out its beauty and symmetry to the eye by his shining. But when the jet of light is gone, the groined arch and fluted column remain beautiful, and can in an instant be lighted again and vindicated. Aunt Mary never liked to throw away any medicine, that if she found a drop of laudanum here, and a pill or two there, a little quinine and a little antimony, mixed them up and swallowed them. So when she came to the tea table, oh no, she never took tea. Can you get a little shells? The cocoa came, and Auntie took cocoa, because it was soothing, and put a little tea in it to make her lively, and if there was a little coffee, that was good for getting rid of the taste. I said that the least acceleration of thought would add indefinite longevity to the man, and we are to go to the best examples in each faculty to take notes for the creation of the complete brain. What differences! Some men cannot see the house till it is built, cannot see the machine till the model is placed before their eyes. Moody, the machinist, when Colburn describes any improvement to him, cried immediately, "Ah, but it hits, a fatal objection. Plato says, choose those who can proceed without aid from their eyes or any other sense with truth to being. Well, now it seems as if this Plato's power of grading or ranking all that offers itself at sight was as good as a duration of 1,000 years. The reason why life is short is because we are confounded by the dazzle of new things, and by the seeming equality which custom sheds on great and small. We are obliged to spend a large part of life in corrections which we should save, if our judgment was sure when we first beheld things. Plato is like those tamers who have charmed down the ferocity of vicious animals, or who by some virulence or ferocity in their own nature have terrified frantic madmen. He looks through things at a glance, and they fly into place, and he walks in life with the security of a god. It seems as if the winds of ages swept through this universal thinking, so wide, so just, yet so minute, that it is impossible that an air of such calmness and long maturity can belong to the hasty, crude, experimental blotting of one lifetime. The celestial mind, incapable of offense, of haste, of care, of inhospitality, of peeping, of memory, incapable of being embarrassed, incapable of discourtesy, treating all with a sovereign equality. Today, carpets; yesterday, the aunts; the day before, the funeral of poor S., and every day the remembrance in the library of the rope of work which I must spin. In this way life is dragged down and confuted. We try to listen to the hymn of gods, and must needs hear this perpetual cock-a-doodle-doo and guitar-cut right under the library windows. They, the gods, ought to respect a life, you say, whose objects are their own. But steadily they throw mud and eggs at us, roll us in the dirt, and jump on us. Solitary imprisonment is written on his coat and hat, on the lines of his face and the limbs of his body, on his brow and on the leaves of laurel on his brow. He wrestles hard with the judge, and does not believe he is in earnest. Solitary imprisonment, replied the judge. Yet with some mitigation, 3 times a day his keeper comes to the window and puts bread and water on the shelf. The keeper's dog he may play with if he will. Bow wow wow, says the dog. People may come from Asia to see him if they like. He is only permitted to become his friend. For good reading, there must be, of course, a yielding, sometimes entire, but always some yielding to the book. Then the reader is refreshed with a new atmosphere and foreign habits. But many minds are incapable of any surrender, so they are like knights of a border castle who, quote, carve at the meal in gloves of steel, and drink the red wine through the helmet barred, and of course their dining is very unsatisfactory. How admirable a university is Plato's Republic, yet set X to read it, he would read nothing in it but X. For the conduct of life, let us not parade our rags. Let us not, moved by vanity, confess and tear out our hair at the corners of the streets, or in the sitting room, but as age and infirmity steal on us, contentedly resign the front seat and the games to these bright children, our better representatives, nor expect compliments or inquiries, much less gifts or love, any longer, which to expect is ridiculous, and not at all wondering why our friends do not come to us, much more wondering, when they do, decently withdraw ourselves into modest and solitary resignation and rest. Believers give themselves most leave to speculate, as they are secure of a return. Nature does not work for classes, but for the whole. So she absorbs them, occupies the adult masses with the care of providing for themselves and their families, to the exclusion of every other thought. Nothing but the brandy of politics will wake them from their brute life. No song of any muse will they hear. But it is plain that the adult's education should be undertaken. When our republic, O Plato, shall begin, the education shall not end with the youth, but shall be as vigorously continued in maturity. We have in no wise exhausted the books. Astronomy invites, and geology and geometry and chemistry. See how Humboldt and Agassiz and Berzelius and Goethe and Faraday and Brown and Lindley work. Let our state be provided with proctors who shall drive the old fellows to school. Let our games offer competition and prizes, and let us keep the fathers up to as high a point of aim as we do the children. Then you will have a state. Now nothing can exceed the disappointment and despondency of such of the people as have arrived at maturity without marriage, in finding themselves absolutely without proper task, and compelled to be either brooms and dusters, or else drones and gourmands. Yet nature selfishly puts them all to marrying and providing, and leaves the exceptions, which she to be sure winks at, to the care of higher power. I mean, she always lets higher power look out for itself, and if any soul has seen anything of truth, she knows it will revolt against all this musty housekeeping of hers, and dedicate itself to sacred uses. Every one for himself, says nature. I look then at a soul born with a task as happy. Life. Some of the sweetest hours of life on retrospect will be found to have been spent with books. Yes, but the sweetness was your own. Had you walked or hoed or swum or sailed or kept school in the same hours, it would have endeared those employments and conditions. Nature has taught each creature to put out from itself its own condition and sphere. Macaulay again. Macaulay's history is full of low merits. It is like English manufactures of all kinds, neat, convenient, portable, saleable, made on purpose for the Harpers to print 100,000 copies of. So far can Birmingham go. Macaulay is in the vanguard of English history, good at drawing a Mississippi panorama, but 'tis cheap work. No memorable line has he written, no sentence. He is remembered by flippancy, on one occasion against Plato and Bacon, but has no affirmative talent. He can write quantities of verses, too, to order, wrote lays or something. No doubt wrote good nonsense verses at Eton, better than Virgil. His chef d'oeuvre was a riddle on the codfish. That was really good. October 19th. Charles Newcomb came, but we grew incapable of events and influences. He too turns the conversation if I try a general remark. His manuscripts which he brought were 6 years old, but full of subtle genius. Intense solitude appears in every sentence. They are soliloquies, and the abridged stenographic wit and eloquence, like that or better than that we are wonted to in MME. He is Brahman existing to little use, if prayer and beauty are not that. Yet he humiliates the proud and staggers the dogmatist, and subverts all the mounds and fortification lines of accustomed thought. Eminently aristocratic beyond any person I remember to have met, because self-centered on a deep center of genius, easy, cheerful, condescending to the greatest, and mortifying Plato and Jesus, if it were possible, by his genuine preference of children and ladies, and the first piece of nature, to all their fame and sanctity. If one's centrality is incomprehensible to us, we can do nothing with him. We may as well affect to snub the sun. One will shine as the other. But though Charles's mind is unsounded, and the walls actually taken out so that he seems open to nature, yet he does not accumulate his wisdom into any amounts of thought. Rarely arrives at a result, perhaps does not care to, so that I say, it seems, instead of my bare walls, your surrounding is really landscapes and perspectives of temples, yet they avail no more to you than if they were landscape paper hangings or fresco pictures of temples. Will fortune never come with both hands full? She either gives a stomach and no food, or else a feast and takes away the stomach. Henry IV. Charles Newcomb. Ah, dear old Swedenborg, and is this thy good, the perfection of man is the love of use, and this fine luminary, brightest of all, can ill conceal his dislike of a general remark, spends his morning at Newport all summer in walking, his afternoons, in society, and has read but one book, this year, namely, an old novel. Dear Swedenborg, if you can catch this American sprig, will you not whip him soundly? He had a fine subtlety like this, that it is not what he thought is, but how he stands to his thought, that we value in friendship. Shakespeare was, quote, the farthest bound of subtlety and universality compatible with individuality, the subtlest of authors, and only just within the possibility of authorship, end quote. Newcomb is my best key to Shakespeare, and he is just beyond authorship. The impartiality of Shakespeare is like that of the light itself, which is no aristocrat, but shines as mellowy on gypsies as on emperors, on bride and corpse, on city and swamp. Quote, I believe that there is no true theory of disease that does not at once suggest cure. End quote. Wilkinson. Big Indians: Plato, Swedenborg, Shakespeare, Montaigne, Goethe, Napoleon. Little Indians: Alcott, Very, Newcomb, Channing, R.W.E., Thoreau. Concord. There is not a fox or a crow or a partridge in Concord who knows the woodlands better than Thoreau. Identity philosophy makes swinging a chain every whit as good as a journey to Oregon, but great is the illusory energy of Vishnu. I suppose the landscape to be full of a race of daemons who move at a faster rate than men, so fast as just to escape our organ of sight. Michelangelo paints with more will, Raphael with obedience of water and flame. Everybody would paint like Raphael if the power of painting were added to everybody. Once more, as I have somewhere written, he who addresses himself to modes or wants that can be dispensed with goes out of fashion, builds his house off the road. But he who addresses himself to problems that every man must come to solve builds his house on the road, and every man must come to it. Jesus' problems are mine, and therefore to Jesus and through Jesus must we go, and Swedenborg had the like wisdom. Nature pays no respect to those who pay any respect to her, was H.J.'s doctrine. Symbolism. What I want to know is the meaning of what I do. Believing that any of my current Mondays or Tuesdays is fate book for me, and believing that hints and telegraphic signals are arriving to me every moment out of the interior eternity. I am tormented with impatience to make them out. We meet people who seem to overlook our game and read us with a smile, but they do not tell us what they read. This is one kind of symbolism. A more limited one is Swedenborg's fancy that certain books of Scripture were exact allegories or written in the angelic and ecstatic speech as other books are not. To what purpose dark ages and barbarous Irish, if I know, as I know, 5 or 6 men, without hardly going out of my village, to whom and with whom all is possible, who restore to me Plato, Shakespeare, Montaigne, Hindu cosmology, yea, Buddha himself, with their audacious intellectual adventure? I hearing get, who had but ears, and sight, who had but eyes before, I moments live, who lived but years, and truth discern, who knew but learning's lore. H. D. Thoreau. From Inspiration, perhaps Thoreau's finest poem. There be those who see this sun, and stars and seasons passing in their appointed times, unmoved by fear. Horace, Epistola 6, Lib 1. November 17th. Yesterday saw the fields covered with cobwebs in every direction, on which the wake of the setting sun appeared as on water. Walked over hill and dell with Channing, who found wonders of color and landscape everywhere, but complained of the want of invention. Quote, why, they had frozen water last year, why should they do it again? Therefore it was so easy to be an artist, because they do the same thing always, and therefore he only wants time to make him perfect in the imitation. Quote, and I believe, too, that pounding is one of the secrets. All summer he gets water au naturel, and in winter they serve it up artistically in this crystal johnny cake. Channing thought the cause of cows was that they made good walking where they fed. Here follows a poem. Roomy eternity casts her schemes rarely, and a rounded age allows to every quality and part in the multitudinous and many-chambered heart. Poet of poets is Time the distiller, Time with the refiner, he hath the vitriol which can dissolve towns into melody. Burn up the libraries, down with the colleges, raise the foundations, drive out the doctors, rout the philosophers, harry the critics, men of particulars, narrowing niggardly something to nothing, all their 10,000 ways end in the neont. All through the countryside rush locomotives, prospering grocers, pouring on newspapers, over their shop fires, settle the state. But for the poet, seldom in centuries comes the well-tempered musical man. He is waited for, he is the complement of one man and all men. The random wayfarer thinks the poet of his kin. This is he that should come, tongue of the secret, key of the caskets of past and of future. Sudden the lustre that hovered round cities, round closets of power, or chambers of commerce, round banks, or round beauties, or state-rending factions, has quit them and perches well pleased on his form. The poet received foremost of all badge of nobility, charter of earth, free of the city, free of the field, knight of each order, mate of each class, fellow of monarchs, and, what is better, fellow of all men. Here follows another poem. But over all this crowning grace, wherefore thanks God his daily praise, is the purging of his eye to see the people of the sky. From blue mount and headland dim, friendly hands stretch forth to him. Him they beckon, him advise of heavenlier prosperities and a more excelling grace. In a truer bosom glow than the wine-fed feasters know, they turn his heart from lovely maids and make the darlings of the earth swainish, coarse, and nothing worth, teach him gladly to postpone pleasures to another stage, beyond the scope of human age. Freely as task at eve undone, waits unblamed tomorrow's sun. Intellect. An affirmative talent is always safe. The critics may do their worst. It is victory. As for Germany, we have had no interest in it since the death of Goethe. All kinds of power usually develop themselves at the same time, and I look in the most active race for the idealism. The Americans went to Heidelberg to find Germany, and discovered with surprise that they had left it behind them in New York. Mr. Sherb attempted last night to unfold Hegel for me, and I caught somewhat what seemed cheerful and large, and that might, and probably did, come by Hindu suggestion. But all abstract philosophy is easily anticipated. It is so structural or necessitated by the mold of the human mind. Schelling said, quote, "The absolute is the union of the ideal and the real." End quote. The world, the universe, is a gigantic flower, but the flower is one function or state of the plant, and the world but a stage or state of the pan. As I have written long ago, the universe is only in transit, or we behold it in shooting the gulf from the past to the future. Alcott is like a slate pencil which has a sponge tied to the other end, and as the point of the pencil draws lines, the sponge follows as fast and erases them. He talks high and wide and expresses himself very happily, and forgets all he has said. If a skillful operator could introduce a lancet and sever the sponge, Alcott would be the prince of writers. Goethe. Angel song and chorus at opening of Faust is magazine or squirt poetry. Goethe, as a man who wished to make the most of himself, was right in avoiding the horrors. I sent Chapman orders to send copies of Representative Men to Thomas Carlyle, J. A. Carlyle, Earl of Lovelace, Arthur Helps, Mrs. Pollitt, W. E. Forster, John Forster, Arthur H. Clow, Miss Ellen Randall, Dr. Samuel Brown, Edinburgh, Edwin Field, J. J. G. Wilkinson. I must add to the list by the next steamer Miss Martineau, Dr. Jacobson, later Bishop of Chester, C. E. Rollins, Jr., John Kenyon, Esquire. Footnote states the book was apparently not actually published until January 1st of 1850, and sheets printed here were sent to Chapman to come out simultaneously in London. Many afterthoughts, as usual with my printing, come just a little too late, and my new book seems to lose all value from their omission. Plainly, one is the justice that should have been done to the unexpressed greatness of the common farmer and laborer. 100 times I have felt the superiority of George and Edmund and Barrows, and yet I continue the parrot echoes of the names of literary nobilities and mediocrities, which bring them, if they dared, into presence of these Concord and Plymouth Norsemen, would be as uncomfortable and ridiculous as mice before cats. It is rare to have the hero and the professor united as in Montaigne, or I might say churl and professor. I value Hyde and Theron because X would shrivel in their presence. They solid and unexpressed, he expressed into gold-leaf, and yet the whole human race agree to value a man precisely in proportion to his power of expression, and to the most expressive man that has existed, namely Shakespeare, they have awarded the highest place. Then again I have to regret that I have not stated of Swedenborg the most important defect, this, namely, that he does not awaken the sentiment of piety. Behmen does. St. Bernard does. Thomas à Kempis, Herbert, that Moravian hymn-maker do. December 14th. Every day shows a new thing to veteran walkers. Yesterday, reflections of trees in the ice, snowflakes, perfect rolls on the ice, beautiful groups of icicles all along the eastern shore of Flint's Pond, in which especially where encrusting the bough of a tree you have the union of the most flowing of the most fixed. Ellery all the way squandering his jewels as if they were icicles, sometimes not comprehended by me, sometimes not heard. How many days can Methusalem go abroad and see somewhat new? When will he have counted the changes of the kaleidoscope? Farmers. When I see one of our young farmers in Sunday clothes, I feel the greatest respect for and joy in them, because I know what powers and utilities are so meekly worn. What I wish to know, they know. What I would so gladly do, they can do. The cold, gloomy day, the rough, rocky pasture, the swamps are invitations and opportunities to them, and yet there is no arrogance in their bearing, but a perfect gentleness, though they know how to take care of the cattle, how to raise and cure and keep their crops. Why a writer should be vain and a farmer not, though the writer admires the farmer, and the farmer doesn't admire the writer, does not appear. England. The dinner, the wine, the homes of England look attractive to the traveler, but they are the poor utmost that a liberal wealth can perform. Alas, the halls of England are musty, the land is full of coal smoke and carpet smell. Not a breath of mountain air dilates the languishing lungs, and the Englishman gets his amends by weaving his web very fine. He is bold and absolute in his narrow circle. He is versed in all his routine, sure and elegant. His stories are good, his sentences solid, and all his statesmen, lawyers, men of letters, and poets finished and solid as the pavement. Rich and poor. The rich man has 1,200 acres of land. The poor man has the universe, and much he has to say of it. But when he, too, comes to hold 1,200 acres, we never hear any more about the universe. Like the New England soil, my talent is good only whilst I work it. If I cease to task myself, I have no thoughts. This is a poor sterile Yankeeism. What I admire and love is the generous and spontaneous soil which flowers and fruits at all seasons. Superlative. People like exaggerated events and activity, like to run to a house on fire, to a murder, an execution, like to tell of a bankruptcy, of a death, of a crime, or of an engagement. They like a rattling town, where a great deal of business is done. The student shuns all this. They like to be in a state of exaggeration. Of course, manly greatness consists in being so much that the mere wash of the sea, the observed passage of the stars, or the almost heard current of time, is event enough, and the full soul cries, "Let not the noise of what you call events disturb me." Here is a right bit of Ellery Channing. Quote, Help's book, called Friends in Council, is inexpressibly dull. In this manufacture the model English excel. Witness their Taylors, Wordsworths, Arnolds, and Scotts, not Walter. Wise, elegant, moderate, and cultivated, yet unreadable. Ellery says of Thoreau, quote, His effects can all be produced by cork and sand, but the substance that produces them is godlike and divine. Natural aristocracy. It is a vulgar error to suppose that a gentleman must be ready to fight. The utmost that can be demanded of the gentleman is that he be incapable of a lie. There is a man who has good sense, is well informed, well read, obliging, cultivated, capable, and has an absolute devotion to truth. He always means what he says, and says what he means, however courteously. You may spit upon him. Nothing could induce him to spit upon you. No praises and no possessions, no compulsion of public opinion. You may kick him. He will think it the kick of a brute. But he is not a brute, and will not kick you in return. But neither your knife and pistol nor your small gifts in courting will ever make the smallest impression on his vote or word. For he is the truth's thug, and goes willingly to ruin his thuggee. Is not he a gentleman? Nature. Van Helmont's definition of nature is, quote, Nature is that command of God whereby a thing is that which it is, and doth what it is commanded to do. Duties are as much impediments to greatness as cares. If a man sets out to be rich, he cannot follow his genius. Neither can he any more, if he wishes to be an estimable son, brother, husband, nephew, and cousin. Neither is life long enough for friendship. 'Tis easy to see that the people will get science as well as the state. Schelling's apropos and its statement was a forlorn hope, and all but fell into the pit. Yet just on the eve of ruin, Oken seized and made the most of it. Of course he was ridiculous, and nowhere but in Germany could he have survived. Yet Hegel, a still more robust dreamer, clung to this identical piece of nonsense. Then it came rebounding to them in melody from the songs of Goethe, and, strange to say, from Geoffroy St. Hilaire's memoirs to the Institute in France. Agassiz brought it to America, and tried it in popular lectures on the towns. It succeeded to admiration, the lecturer having, of course, the prudence to disown these bad names of his authors. The idea was that the form or type became transparent in the actual forms of successive ages, as presented in geology. Stallo. Geologic strata, quote, whose superposition in space is a sufficient warrant for their succession in time, Quote, the configurations of nature are more than a symbol, they are the gesticular expression of nature's inner life. Quote, the development of all individual forms will be a spiral. Quote, in the song of birds, the animal kingdom celebrates its constitutional day with trumpets and fifes. Feuerbach. I easily distinguish three eras. 1. The Greek, when men deified nature. Jove was in the air, Neptune in the sea, Pluto in the earth, Naiads in the fountains, Dryads in the woods, Oreads in the mountains, happy, beautiful beatitude of nature. 2. The Christian, when the soul became pronounced, and craved a heaven out of nature and above it, looking on nature now as evil. The world was a mere stage and school, a snare, and the powers that ruled here were devils, hostile to the soul. And now, lastly, 3. The modern, when the two idealistic tendencies of the Christian period, running into the diseases of Kant, monachism, and a church, demonstrating the impossibility of Christianity, have forced men to retrace their steps and rally again on nature. But now the tendency is to marry mind to nature, and to put nature under the mind, convert the world into the instrument of right reason. Man goes forth to the dominion of the world by commerce, by science, and by philosophy. Van Helmont's distribution is understanding, will, memory. Affirmative. Quote, the soul understands in peace and rest, and not in doubting. Van Helmont. The understanding transforms itself into the image of the thing understood. Quote, indeed, study for eternity smiled on me. Eloquence, music. Chladni's experiment seems to me central. He strewed sand on glass, and then struck the glass with tuneful accords, with sand assumed symmetrical figures. With discord the sand was thrown about amorphously. It seems then that Orpheus is no fable. You have only to sing, and the rocks will crystallize, sing, and the plant will organize, sing, and the animal will be born. Culture, the height of culture, highest behavior consists in the identification of the ego with the universe, so that when a man says, I think, I hope, I find, he might properly say, the human race thinks, hopes, finds. He states a fact which commands the understandings and affections of all the company, and yet at the same time he shall be able continually to keep sight of his biographical ego. I had an ague, I had a fortune, my father had black hair, etc., as rhetoric, fun, or footmen, as to this grand and public ego without impertinence or ever confounding them. Editor's note. As in the previous volumes, a few of Mr. Emerson's favorite authors from early youth steadily recurring in the lists of the first volumes, as Homer, Plato, Plutarch, Montaigne, Shakespeare, Milton, Herbert, Swedenborg, Wordsworth, and others, are not given in this list. In spite, however, of the frequent mention of Plotinus, Proclus, and other Neoplatonists, and of the Oriental scriptures and poets, these names will appear as showing when Mr. Emerson was reading them. Carlyle and Goethe will also be mentioned. It often happens that an allusion to an author or book may be in a passage not included in the selection here printed. End note. What follows then is a list of the author or books quoted or referred to by Emerson in Journal for 1849, but as I ceased to do, I forgot way back in some other journal collection, I am not going to be reading 3 minutes of uh, the last names of authors and a scattering of books, which in many cases are the same names like it mentioned in the editor's note above. And so if you want to know exact, or at least a sort of rehashing of all the people he quoted as you were listening along to this particular journal collection, you will hear those as I read them, or you can go into the journal collection, which is in popular domain. It's page 80 of volume 8 of the collected works, and you can read them all there. But like I said, I will be omitting these because they seem just a little bit redundant and not really worthwhile just to list names over and over and over again. Anyway, with that said, I will go ahead and conclude this particular recording. We have reached, of course, the end of journal collection number 40, dating from 1849, when Emerson was 46 years old. Thank you for listening.